To welcome among us today in our Ukrainian Catholic University a very distinguished guest, Mr. Майкл Лі, who is Director General for Enlargement in the European Union. I can hardly imagine a better continuation of our discussion here at our university about European Union and Ukraine, about the issues of integration that, as you might know, was launched a few weeks ago by very successful, excellent School of International Journalism that was conducted by our School of Journalism. And by the way, there was a competition among the members or participants of that school from all over Ukraine, and some of them got the opportunity to go to the summit in Vilnius in a few weeks and to have follow-ups on what will be going on there. I also think that today is a really great opportunity to have such a guest here, because today we also celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Maastricht Treaty. Exactly 20 years ago, EU became what is now today. And I think that to say a few more words about our guest, we really could hardly have a better person to talk about the issues that are so relevant for the present context of the Ukrainian and EU relations. Before Mr. Lee became Director General for Enlargement, he served for 3 years as External Relations Deputy Director General with responsibility for European neighborhood policy, relations with Eastern Europe, Southern Caucasus, Central Asia, Middle East, and the Mediterranean countries. He also was a cabinet member for various commissioners and director in the task force for the EU accession negotiations. But what is most important? Mr. Lee has more than 30 years, actually I think 37 years of experience working in different EU structures, EU institutions, and I will not be enumerating them, not to steal time from his lecture. And I think he must know not only what has happened, but what will happen also in concerning different EU processes, and perhaps he might have been also the architect or designer of some of them, given his positions. We are looking forward to your lecture, Mr. Lee, and I think that we will have I hope we will have a beautiful session here. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed for those very warm words of welcome. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Lviv, to be here at your university, and to see that there is so much thinking about the future, so many preparations for a prosperous and successful future for Lviv, for this region, for this country, and that there are so many different faculties at the university in one way or another turn towards the future. I felt the same spirit yesterday when I visited the City Hall and met the mayor. One gets a sense of dynamism and ambition and the desire to see the town, the region, the country really advance along the path of democracy, of modernization and development. And I find this spirit in what is admittedly a challenging political environment extremely inspiring. I would simply add to the very kind words of introduction that, in fact, after many years working for the European institutions 2 years ago, I became an independent political advisor, and I advise, amongst others now, the Foundation for Effective Governance in Kiev, and I work with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is dedicated to transatlantic cooperation in many areas. What I would like to do this afternoon, briefly, is to create some context for the meeting that takes place in Vilnius later this month, and to talk about some of the challenges we face, and perhaps to suggest some of the ways in which we may meet those challenges. But first of all, a few words of background and almost of history. The association agreement, which is on the table for signature if all the conditions are met at the end of this month, is the product of a decade of gestation. What happened at the beginning of the 21st century was that the European Union completed the process of negotiation with 10 new countries that were scheduled to become members of the European Union in 2004. 8 countries in Central and Eastern Europe, including your immediate neighbors to the west, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary, and 2 countries in the Mediterranean region, the Republic of Cyprus and Malta. In 2003, 2004, the member of the European Commission with whom I worked very closely, Chris Patton, and others, reflected on the need for a new policy for countries that would be directly adjoining the enlarged European Union and that would become our immediate neighbors with the accession of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Estonia, and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And the message that the European Union intended to give in 2003 with its wider Europe policy that then became the European Neighbourhood Policy was that the 2004 enlargement was not one that was in any sense turned against countries that were not acceding at that time. It was a project from which we hoped all of Europe would benefit. We were not going to create a fortress Europe, and particularly where there were very close links across the border and a flourishing cross-border trade, as there was and as there is, between Ukraine and its neighbors to the west. We wanted these links to continue and to develop. And the broad concept that the European Union put forward at that time was to offer to our neighbors to the east, and I must say, first and foremost, Ukraine was in people's minds at this time, along with Moldova and potentially Belarus, if the political circumstances ever permitted it, was that you should share in the process of European integration. The EU essentially said, look, if you implement a series of political and economic reforms that will create conditions in which we can say we have shared values and shared interests, then the European Union will open up, will give you a stake in the single market of the European Union, a place in some of our institutions. The question of membership was not on the table. The EU needed to digest the huge enlargement of 2004, 2007, with 100 million new citizens in the European Union. But of course, as a European country, Ukraine was and is eligible for membership in the European Union eventually, when it appears that in practice we have shared values and implement them on a daily basis, and when the EU becomes ready, having overcome the recent economic and financial crisis and fully come to terms with the last enlargement, to consider the possibility of future membership. So membership was not on the table for the time being, but was never excluded. Chris Patten had this vision. There was a debate and a discussion, and of course other EU member states, besides your immediate neighbours to the west, said, look, if there's going to be an EU neighbourhood policy, it must embrace all of our neighbours. If you're Spanish, if you're Italian, and you think about neighbourhood, what do you think about? You think about Morocco, you think about Tunisia, about Libya, about Egypt. These are the countries that the southern member states of the EU had the most traditional links with. So really what happened was that a policy originally designed to strengthen links with Eastern Europe became a policy that embraced all of the neighbours of the European Union, to the east, to the south, and to the southeast. And it was said that the goal was to create a ring of prosperity around the European Union, of countries with which the European Union would have close links, and that this would strengthen shared values and interests. Cutting a very long story short, what really has happened over the last decade has been that this aspiration, very much inspired by the model of EU enlargement, has not really proved feasible for the countries to the south and the southeast around the Mediterranean basin. I'm sure you've all followed what has taken place in the last 2 years in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and uprisings that were originally inspired by aspirations to liberalism and democracy have in fact been very largely diverted into other directions. And there's a real risk that this transition process around the Mediterranean will, at least for the time being, be a transition partly towards new forms of authoritarianism or to dysfunctional democracy in various forms. Now, the members of the European Union that thought first and foremost about our neighbours to the east, viewing these developments, said we need a specific policy for our neighbours to the east. And therefore, in 2008, Poland and Sweden put forward a new model within the broad framework of the EU's neighbourhood policy, which came to have the name of Eastern Partnership. And quite ironically, this brought the neighbourhood policy back to the point of origin, which was your own country and your neighbours, as well as the countries in the Southern Caucasus. And since 2008, we have been working on the substance of a new relationship between Ukraine, Moldova, the European Union, Georgia, some of the other countries in this region. What is the concept behind the Eastern Partnership? The concept is to create a form of relationship which is very far-reaching and which creates a common agenda to work on for several years in the future, which can give reality to the idea that we have shared values, shared interests, and that we are progressively looking at ways in which we can integrate economically in order to bring benefits to the population, both in the EU and in Ukraine. And the core instrument that was chosen for this was a very ambitious association agreement. And it took 4 years to negotiate. So the agreement that is on the table for signature in Vilnius is the product of 4 years negotiation. It is an association agreement, and linked to that, what is described as a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, DCFTA in the jargon. I would point out that this agreement is actually more wide-ranging and more ambitious than the Europe agreements, as they were called, which preceded the accession of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and so on to the European Union. And the vision is free trade, in other words, the abolition of tariff and other obstacles to free movement of goods and to a considerable extent of services between the European Union and Ukraine, but equally important, accompanied by a wide range of regulatory convergence. In other words, bringing closer together the regulations that govern economic activity in a wide range of areas, with Ukraine gradually coming closer to the standards, the norms that apply in the European Union. This applies to a wide range of fields, including, for example, the environment as it affects costs that go into the production of goods, areas such as health, food safety, and industrial norms and standards. For this reason, when we look at the agreement, we can see that it is to some extent asymmetrical. The European Union, under this agreement, will open up its borders to imports from Ukraine on a tariff-free basis very rapidly, and Ukraine will have a longer period, mostly a period of 8 to 10 years, before it needs to open up equally to the European Union's exports. And during that period, Ukraine is expected to adapt its laws and standards so that they are compatible with those in the European Union. For this reason, it is said, I think with reason, that for Ukraine there will be rather high short-term costs in adopting new legislation and the institutional framework and the investment needed to meet those standards in areas, for example, like food safety, for meat, for dairy products, or for industrial goods meeting environmental standards, before Ukraine gets the full benefit in practice from access to the EU markets. So there is likely to be a certain shock of adjustment in the short term, but then very considerable medium-term and long-term gains. This is very similar to what happened a decade and a half, almost 2 decades ago, for example, in Poland. It's worth remembering that after the collapse of communism in Poland, 1989, 4 years went by before the European Union offered a membership perspective to Poland. And Poland made these drastic reforms that often go by the name of shock therapy, Mr. Balcerowicz's programs of radical economic reforms, before Poland had been offered the possibility of joining the European Union. And in a sense, there is something comparable in the case of Ukraine. Just like Poland, Ukraine needs to decide for itself that it wants these changes for the benefit of its own people in order that the country can go through modernization and development and increased prosperity. And then the question about closer links with the European Union comes in to reinforce choices that need to be made within the country itself. The EU doesn't expect Ukraine to make all these efforts by itself. There is envisaged an important program of assistance. These days it's around the order of 185 million euros a year to help with the process of adjustment. and there are EU experts who are ready to come to Ukraine to engage in twinning programs, technical assistance, advice and support to help this process of adjustment. Now, as with any other very close relationship, this needs to be based on a common understanding as to our shared values and where we're headed. And for that reason, the EU has provided for a number of conditions related to the strengthening of democracy, the rule of law, the protection of minorities, the functioning of the justice system, and so on. We know these are very challenging issues and that profound changes are needed in the medium to long term, and that they can't be achieved just by ticking a few boxes in the short term. Nonetheless, in politics, signals and symbols are very important. And in the last 6 months, Ukraine has made very extensive efforts to meet some of these short-term conditions related particularly to the justice system, the functioning of the prosecutor system, and so on within the country. There are 1 or 2 conditions that remain to be fulfilled. These, in fact, have nothing to do with any individual, much though public attention is obviously focused on that. It really is a question of the European countries needing to feel that Ukraine is on a path in which the justice system is becoming increasingly fair, objective, and transparent, and that selective justice is not applied for political reasons. That is the reason for what might otherwise seem rather paradoxical, that a major decision concerning the country's future and its relationship with the European Union should be based on what happens to one individual. This is really not the case. It's rather a symbol of the commitment of the government, of the parliament, of the people to move in a certain direction. Now, we know that this process, which is very much inspired by the notion of European integration, of rapprochement between peoples, is also seen in a geopolitical context, particularly by Russia. And this is something that we've all become extremely aware of in recent weeks and months. I think we in Brussels and throughout the European Union are convinced that this is a profound mistake on the part of Russia to view these developments in what is often described as zero-sum terms. In other words, the gain, as it were, of the European Union is the loss of Russia. We don't see it in that context at all. First of all, we think that Russia too would benefit greatly from Ukraine's rapprochement with the European Union. Russian companies, Russian investors are very present in Ukraine, and their companies too will enjoy free access to European markets if they're present in Ukraine through the association agreement and DCFTA. It is entirely the case that the association agreement, the DCFTA, is not compatible with the customs union proposed by Russia. By the way, the customs union as it stands today is not compatible with Russia's own WTO commitments. Russia is in violation of a number of its basic commitments to the WTO through certain of the terms of the customs union. At the same time, this is really not either or. Ukraine's trade with the European Union and its present trade with Russia are rather similar, with imports around 30% of all imports coming respectively from Russia and from the European Union, and Ukraine's exports around 25-26% in each case going respectively to the EU and to Russia. Potentially, however, I think, when Ukraine's industry and services are modernized and become more competitive, you need to consider that through the association agreement, DCFTA, Ukraine will become part of a market of 500 million citizens with a GDP now of the region of 13 trillion euros a year. and that this offers enormous potential to the country. It's not a matter of choosing. The association agreement, DCFTA, is entirely compatible with a free trade agreement between Ukraine and Russia, just as you have free trade agreements with Kazakhstan, for example, and Belarus, I think. And nothing prevents Ukraine from having a free trade agreement with Russia in the future and with continuing the process of building up its commerce and investment with Russia, while at the same time strengthening its standards and moving towards the European Union. So I think that we do not see this in geopolitical terms, we do not see it in zero-sum terms. We see it as part of the modernization and development of Ukraine realizing its own aspirations for its own people without turning its back on other neighbors and in particular on the European Union. We're holding our breath before the Vilnius meeting. We hope very much the conditions will be satisfied. In the past, the European Union has found that it can often make progress by setting a deadline, because this concentrates minds and efforts towards achieving a breakthrough on that particular date. So I do think that Vilnius is a very important rendezvous, and it would be foolish today to speculate what would happen if there's not a breakthrough on that date. I personally think that this relationship is too important to be subject to what happens on any given moment, even though all efforts are being made towards that moment. But perhaps in our discussion session we might also consider what happens after Vilnius and what will be the important developments in the future and what has to happen in order to bring to realization the aspirations set out in the association agreement. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I'd be very happy to enter into a discussion with you, to hear your comments or to respond to your questions. Thank you.